The wrong seat, the wrong deal. John Carter had never been on a spaceship this big before. He was just a simple mechanic from Earth, traveling to a distant space station for work. The Celestial Voyager was a massive luxury cruise ship carrying thousands of passengers, aliens from different worlds, wealthy traders, and even royalty. John didn't care about any of that. He just wanted to find his seat, sit back, and get some rest. The spaceship's automated voice guided him through the shiny golden corridors. Passenger 328, please proceed to Section A, Seat 47. John followed the directions, dragging his small bag behind him. The ship was so huge, it felt like walking through a floating city. He passed through different sections. Some looked like normal passenger areas, but others were grand, filled with strange alien designs, soft glowing lights, and floating servants carrying drinks. When he finally reached his seat, John let out a sigh of relief. Finally, he muttered, dropping into the large, comfortable chair. That was his first mistake. The chair was soft, luxurious, too good for an economy-class traveler. A golden symbol was glowing on the armrest, but John didn't notice. He just leaned back and closed his eyes. Then the room went silent. John opened his eyes to find everyone staring at him. The aliens around him, dressed in royal robes and armor, were whispering. Some looked shocked. Others looked excited. A tall, blue-skinned alien with golden eyes stepped forward. His sharp features were serious, his long silver robes decorated with ancient-looking symbols. He pointed at John and spoke in a deep voice. The human has taken the seat of the sacred vow. The ritual begins. John blinked. Ah, what? Suddenly, loud drums echoed through the chamber. A group of alien priests entered, wearing golden masks. Behind them, a massive doorway opened, and a woman stepped in. She was stunning, tall, with dark silver skin that shimmered under the lights. Her long braided hair was decorated with golden rings, and her deep violet eyes burned with intensity. She walked like a warrior, her black and gold armor making her look both beautiful and deadly. The whispers grew louder. Princess Xyra had arrived. John gulped. This can't be good. The blue-skinned man raised his hands. The human has chosen the throne of the warrior's vow. The marriage ritual begins. John choked on air. Wait, Memedarag, what are you talking about? Xyra crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. So, this is my groom, she said, her voice sharp like a blade. A mere human? This must be a joke. John raised his hands. No. I think there's been a mistake. I just sat down. The priest looked confused. The seat of the sacred vow is no accident. The one who sits accepts the marriage trial. John's heart pounded. Marriage trial. No, listen, I just needed to rest my legs. I don't want to marry anyone. The crowd gasped. A low murmur spread through the chamber. Some aliens looked insulted. Others were grinning like they were watching the greatest drama of their lives. The blue-skinned man turned to a massive figure sitting on a golden throne at the front of the room. The Emperor. He was a towering, armored alien with 4 glowing red eyes and a deep rumbling voice. Father, Xyra said, bowing slightly. Surely you won't allow this. A human is unworthy. The Emperor studied John for a long moment. Then he spoke. The ritual has begun. It cannot be undone. If the human refuses, he will face the consequences. John swallowed hard. What kind of consequences? The Emperor's red eyes burned. Death. John froze. The room was so silent he could hear his own heartbeat. Okay, he said, voice shaking. So, just to be clear, if I don't marry her, I die. The priest nodded. That is correct. The bond has been chosen. John turned to Xyra. Do you want to marry me? She scowled. Absolutely not. John turned back to the priest. See, we both agree this is a bad idea. Can't we cancel it? The priest shook his head. Only through the trial of the vow. You must prove your unworthiness in battle. If you lose, the bond is broken. If you win, you stay as her husband. John's stomach dropped. Battle. The emperor raised his hand. The trial begins at first light. Prepare yourself, human. John opened his mouth to protest, but two massive alien guards grabbed him, lifting him off the ground. Hey, I don't even know how to fight, John shouted. Zara smirked, walking past him. Then you won't last long. The guards dragged John away, while the crowd cheered. The wrong seat. The wrong deal. And now, John was trapped in the biggest mistake of his life. The princess, the problem. John Carter sat inside a cold, dimly lit chamber, rubbing his temples. His heart was still pounding from what had just happened. One wrong seat. One stupid mistake. And now, he was engaged to an alien princess. His hands were bound by a glowing energy cuff, not too tight but enough to remind him that he wasn't free to walk away. Two massive alien guards stood at the entrance, watching him like a prisoner. The room smelled strange, like a mix of metal and burning incense. The only thing keeping John from completely panicking was the fact that, somehow, this still felt like a bad dream. Unfortunately, it wasn't. The heavy door slid open with a sharp hiss, and Princess Zara walked in. She looked even more intimidating up close. Her silver skin shimmered under the lights, her violet eyes cold as a winter storm. She wore a tight-fitting battle suit with golden armor plates covering her shoulders and arms. A long, curved blade rested on her hip. John swallowed hard. I guess we should talk. Zara crossed her arms. There is nothing to talk about, human. John, he corrected. My name is John. She ignored him. You have made a great insult to my people. Sitting in that seat was an honor meant for a warrior, a leader, someone worthy of ruling by my side. But instead, I get you. John sighed. Yeah, believe me, I didn't plan on this either. But it's not my fault your fancy chair doesn't come with a warning sign. Her eyes flashed with irritation. Only fools do not recognize the throne of Oz. Well, congratulations, I'm the biggest fool in the galaxy, John muttered. So, can we fix this? Maybe tell your father this was just a mix-up. Zara's expression hardened. The Emperor does not accept mistakes. The law is clear. The only way out is through combat. And if you survive, you remain my husband. John let out a nervous laugh. You make that sound like the worst option. She stepped closer, her presence radiating strength and confidence. You do not understand, human. My people, the Drakari, respect only power. If I marry a weakling, I will be seen as weak myself. I have fought my entire life to prove my worth as a warrior and as a ruler. And now, thanks to you, my future is a joke. John studied her. There was something deeper behind her anger. Pride, yes, but also fear. She didn't just hate this situation. She was terrified of what it meant for her. Okay, he said slowly. I get it. You don't want this marriage. I don't want this marriage. That means we're on the same side, right? Zara narrowed her eyes. What are you suggesting? John took a deep breath. Look, I'm no warrior. I don't stand a chance in a fight against your people. But if the goal is to prove I'm unworthy, then maybe you can help me lose. Her jaw tightened. You want me to throw the trial? Why not? John shrugged. We both get what we want. I lose, you walk away without disgrace, and I get to keep my head attached to my body. Zara stared at him for a long moment. Then she let out a short, humorless laugh. You truly do not understand my people. John frowned. What do you mean? She leaned forward, her voice low and sharp. If you die too quickly in battle, my people will believe you were too weak to even challenge me. That would insult me even more. The only way I prove my strength is if you put up a real fight before losing. John's stomach dropped. So, you're saying if I go down in the first 5 seconds, it's actually worse for you. Much worse, she confirmed. John ran a hand down his face. So I have to fight you seriously, just long enough for it to look real. Then I lose in a way that makes you look strong. Zaira gave a slow nod. Yes, but if you win. Not gonna happen, John interrupted. Let's be real, I'm a mechanic. You're a warrior princess. This fight's over before it even starts. Zaira studied him again. You do not look strong, she admitted. Your body lacks the muscle of a true fighter. And yet, John frowned. Yet what? She tilted her head. You did not run when the Emperor sentenced you to battle. You are afraid, yet you stand here, speaking calmly, planning your survival. I do not understand it, but you are not as pathetic as I first thought. John snorted. Wow, that's probably the nicest thing anyone said to me today. Zaira turned sharply. Do not misunderstand. You are still doomed. The door opened again, and the two guards stepped inside. One of them grunted in their deep alien tongue. Zaira nodded. It is time. The trial begins now. John's stomach twisted. His plan wasn't perfect, but it was all he had. He just needed to last long enough in the fight before losing. Simple, right? The guards unlocked his energy cuffs, then threw a weapon at his feet. John looked down. It was a sword, a massive double-edged blade with a hilt decorated in glowing runes. It looked ancient and very sharp. John picked it up and nearly dropped it. It was heavy. He had never used a sword before in his life. Zaira smirked. Good. You will die with honor. John gulped. As the guards led him out into the grand arena, the sound of thousands of aliens cheering echoed through the ship. This was it, a battle for survival. And if John messed this up, it was going to be a very short fight. The escape plan. John Carter stood at the entrance of the grand celestial arena, heart hammering inside his chest. The roaring cheers of thousands of aliens echoed through the colossal space, shaking the very floor beneath him. Bright lights illuminated the battlefield, a massive circular pit made of polished black stone, covered in ancient battle markings. In the center of the arena stood Princess Zaira. She was ready. Clad in her elegant but deadly golden armor, her long silver braid flowing behind her like a warrior queen's banner. She gripped a curved plasma sword in one hand. Her violet eyes were locked onto John with cold determination. John, on the other hand, was not ready. In his trembling hands, he held the massive Drakari warblade, an ancient rune-covered weapon designed for warriors twice his size. He could barely lift the thing without it dragging on the floor. The crowd erupted into booming war chants, stomping their feet, eager for the fight to begin. This is bad. John's original plan, to lose quickly but make Zaira look good, was falling apart by the second. The moment he stepped into the arena, he realized something. These people didn't just want to fight. They wanted a show. If John simply collapsed in the first 10 seconds, it wouldn't be enough. The Drakari didn't respect cowards or weaklings. If they thought John wasn't even worthy of facing Zaira in combat, she'd lose just as much respect. Meaning John had to at least pretend to be a fighter. Which was a problem. Because he wasn't. The massive gong sounded, vibrating through the air. The battle had begun. Zaira didn't waste time. She charged. John barely managed to dodge as she swung her plasma blade toward his side. The heat from the energy crackled in the air. If she had hit him, he wouldn't just be cut, he'd be vaporized. Stars above. Wo you ori act to you a alloy to lying to kill me, John yelped, stumbling backward. Zaira circled him, her blade glowing with pulsing red light. I cannot hold back, she said coldly. That would be an even greater insult. John gulped. Great. She lunged again. John did the only thing he could. He rolled out of the way. The crowd booed. They didn't want to see him dodge. They wanted blood. Zaira narrowed her eyes. Fight me, human. Trust me, John gasped. I would love to. But there's one tiny problem. I have no idea what I'm doing." She swung her blade again, forcing John to stumble backward. The tip of her weapon grazed his shirt, burning a hole through the fabric. He winced. Okay, screw this plan. He needed a way out. The escape plan. John's mind raced. There was no way he could beat Sarah in a fair fight. But what if he didn't have to fight her at all? His eyes darted around the arena. Exits. There were 4 massive gates around the battlefield, sealed shut. The only way out was through those doors. Or above. John glanced up at the towering energy barrier that surrounded the arena. It was a force field, meant to keep fighters inside while the crowd watched safely from their seats. It flickered slightly at the edges, like a pulsing blue net. An idea sparked in John's mind. He turned to Sarah. "You want to see me fight?" he called, gripping his sword tighter. Sarah frowned. "At last, you accept death." "Not exactly," John muttered. Instead of attacking, John did something that made the entire crowd gasp. He ran. Not away from Sarah, but toward the arena wall. The audience shouted in confusion as John sprinted full speed. His heart pounded in his chest. His arms burned as he dragged the massive sword behind him. Sarah's eyes widened. What? John used all his strength to launch himself up onto a stone pillar near the edge of the battlefield. The moment his feet left the ground, Sarah moved. She was fast. Too fast. With a single leap, she landed behind him, slashing her blade toward his legs. John had 1 second to react. He twisted his body and swung his own sword downward, not at Sarah, but at the pillar beneath him. Crack! The ancient stone shattered, and the force of the impact threw John into the air. The crowd screamed. For a split second, John was weightless. He had 1 chance to make this work. He reached out and grabbed onto the force field. Energy rippled through his body, sending shocks of electricity racing through his limbs. But he held on. Sarah landed gracefully below, watching in stunned silence as John climbed up the barrier, inch by inch. "Impossible," she whispered. John gritted his teeth. His arms ached. His fingers burned. The energy from the barrier made his entire body feel like it was being cooked alive. But he kept climbing. If he could just get over the top, he could. The force field flared violently. With a sudden burst of energy, the shield rejected him, throwing him backward. John crashed to the ground with a painful thud, landing flat on his back. The crowd gasped. Then they exploded into wild cheers. They had never seen a challenger attempt something so insane. John groaned. He was alive. Barely. Sarah stood over him, shaking her head. For the first time, she almost looked impressed. "You are either the bravest fool I have ever met," she said, "or the most suicidal." John coughed. "I'll take that as a compliment." Sarah turned to the Emperor's grand throne, high above the arena. "Father," she called, "the human has proven he is not weak. He is untrained, but his spirit is undeniable." The Emperor's red eyes studied John. The crowd waited in silence. Then the Emperor laughed, a deep booming sound that shook the air. "Very well," the Emperor declared. "The human shall not die today, but his fate remains undecided." John exhaled in relief. He wasn't dead, but he was far from free. And worse, Sarah was looking at him differently now. Like he wasn't just an accident. Like he was something more. The wedding twist. The celestial voyager was alive with celebration. Alien musicians played deep, vibrating tones that echoed through the vast halls. Glowing banners of Drakari royal insignia hung from golden pillars. Hundreds of noble guests, warriors, and diplomats from across the galaxy gathered in a massive ceremonial chamber, eager to witness the final bonding ritual between Princess Sarah and the human, John Carter. John, however, was not celebrating. He sat in a grand, throne-like chair at the head of the ceremonial hall, dressed in a royal robe that was far too tight. A decorative golden collar sat uncomfortably around his neck. The heavy, embroidered cloak draped over his shoulders made him feel like he was being slowly crushed under tradition. At his side, Syra stood tall and fierce. She looked every bit the warrior queen, her armor polished to perfection, her violet eyes unreadable. To the watching crowd, she seemed calm and collected. But John, having spent enough time with her now, could see it, the subtle tension in her jaw, the way her fingers curled slightly into fists. She didn't want this wedding any more than he did. And yet here they were. John leaned toward her and whispered, "Tell me again why we can't just run." Syra didn't look at him as she replied, "Because if we flee now, my father will hunt you to the edges of the galaxy and burn your homeworld for dishonoring our people." John blinked. "Right. That." A loud gong rang through the hall. The Drakari high priest, draped in long golden robes, stepped forward. He raised his hands, and the crowd fell silent. "The time has come," the priest announced, his voice deep and commanding. "By the laws of our ancestors, the vow of strength shall be sealed. The union of warrior and consort shall begin." The crowd erupted into cheers. John clenched his fists. He had barely survived the arena. He thought that once he proved himself, he'd be given the chance to walk away. Instead, things had only gotten worse. Because now, the emperor expected him to follow through with the marriage. And if John refused, well, he had no doubt that Drakari executions were not quick and painless. The high priest turned toward them. "Step forward and take the final vow." Syra hesitated. It was barely noticeable, but John caught it. For the first time, she looked at him, not with anger, not with resentment, but with something almost close to regret. She didn't want to do this, and yet she was bound by duty. Just like him. The priest raised the ceremonial blade, a long curved dagger with an obsidian edge. To seal the vow of strength, the priest declared, both warriors must offer a drop of their blood. John's stomach twisted. Blood. He hated the idea of stabbing himself in front of an alien crowd, but he'd been through worse. He reached for the blade. Boom! A sudden explosion rocked the chamber. Smoke and fire burst from the northern entrance, sending alien nobles screaming as the ground trembled. Before John could even react, a squad of heavily armed mercenaries stormed into the hall. They were not Drakari. Their armor was sleek, dark, and advanced, covered in red insignias John didn't recognize. Their weapons glowed with volatile plasma energy. John's instincts screamed, this wasn't just an attack. It was an assassination. G.E.T. Devon. Syra roared. Before John could even process what was happening, she had already drawn her sword and rushed forward. The mercenaries opened fire. Bolts of burning plasma streaked across the hall, ripping through banners, tables, and alien nobles. The Emperor's personal guards rushed to defend him, clashing with the assassins in a chaotic melee. John, still in his ridiculous ceremonial robe, threw himself behind a fallen statue. His heart pounded as he peeked over the edge. Syra was fighting like a demon. Her blade flashed as she deflected incoming plasma shots. She moved with terrifying precision, spinning, slashing, disarming enemies in seconds. But there were too many of them. John gritted his teeth. He needed a weapon. His eyes darted around the ruined ceremonial platform. The ceremonial dagger. He grabbed it and dashed forward. Syra had just taken down 2 attackers when another mercenary took aim at her back. John didn't think. He acted. He threw himself forward, tackling the gunman just as the plasma rifle fired. The shot missed Syra by inches, scorching a deep mark into the floor. The mercenary snarled, wrestling against John. He was stronger, but John had gravity and desperation on his side. John grabbed the dagger and, without thinking, stabbed downward. The blade sank into the mercenary's chest. He let out a strangled gasp, his body twitching. Then he went still. John let go, his hands shaking. His heart was hammering. He had never killed before. Zyra turned, her eyes widening slightly as she saw John standing over the fallen mercenary. For a moment, she just stared at him. Then she smirked. Not bad, human. John took a deep breath. I really hope that was self-defense. Before Zyra could reply, a loud horn blast filled the chamber. The Emperor's royal guard had arrived. Massive, battle-armored warriors wielding energy lances. The mercenaries immediately retreated, vanishing into the smoke. As the chaos settled, John finally took a step back, his hands still trembling. The Emperor rose from his throne, his red eyes burning with fury. Who sent these assassins? His voice boomed. A wounded guard struggled to stand. They carried the insignia of the Orion Syndicate. Gasps echoed through the crowd. Even Zyra tensed. John frowned. Who? Zyra turned to him, her voice serious. The Orion Syndicate is the most dangerous criminal empire in the galaxy. If they want me dead, it means one thing. John's stomach dropped. What? She clenched her fists. Someone doesn't want me ruling the Drakari Empire. Silence fell over the chamber. Then the Emperor spoke. This union was meant to strengthen our kingdom. But now, it seems we have greater enemies than we knew. His gaze fell upon John. The human has proven himself once more. He is no mere accident. If the Orion Syndicate fears this alliance, then it must be upheld. John's breath caught in his throat. The Emperor turned to the priest. Seal the vow. The priest bowed. It is done. John's blood ran cold. No. It was too late. The wedding was happening. And now, John wasn't just marrying a warrior princess. He was at the center of an intergalactic war. The new husband, the new war. John Carter never imagined getting married like this. There was no music, no cake, no slow dance under the stars. Just the cold realization that his life had changed forever. The moment the wedding was sealed, John felt the weight of an entire empire crashing down on his shoulders. He was no longer just some unlucky human who sat in the wrong seat. Now he was the official consort to Princess Zyra, the future ruler of the Drakari Empire. And apparently, that meant a whole lot of people wanted him dead. The aftermath of the wedding. After the chaos of the assassination attempt, John found himself escorted through the royal palace of the Celestial Voyager. Towering guards surrounded him as he was led into a private chamber, ornate, golden, and filled with alien artifacts he couldn't even begin to understand. Zyra was already there, pacing in frustration. The moment the doors shut, she turned on him. You were supposed to lose. John groaned, rubbing his face. You think I don't know that? I had a plan. But then, surprise, mercenaries with plasma rifles showed up, and now I'm a married man with a bounty on my head. Zyra sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. This is a disaster. John threw his hands up. Tell me about it. What even happens now? Before Zyra could answer, the chamber doors slid open. Standing there was Emperor Valzor. The towering ruler of the Drakari Empire stepped inside, his golden robes flowing like a storm behind him. His 4 glowing red eyes locked onto John with an unreadable expression. John tensed. He still wasn't sure if this guy wanted to congratulate him or execute him. The Emperor finally spoke. You survived the arena. You defended my daughter. And now your name is whispered across the empire. John blinked. Wait, what? Valzor gave a slow nod. News of the attack has spread. The people believe the Orion Syndicate fears you, that they tried to stop this marriage because they know you will make our empire stronger. John swallowed. That's not exactly true. The Emperor ignored him. The Drakari do not follow kings through words alone. We follow strength. You have shown it. But now you must prove that you are worthy of standing beside my daughter. John's stomach dropped. Wait, what does that mean? Syra sighed. It means he's about to send you to war. Thrown into the battlefield. John had exactly 2 days to prepare before he was thrown into an active war zone. The Drakari Empire was already locked in a border conflict with several rival factions. The Orion Syndicate, however, had just escalated things by trying to assassinate Syra. Now the Emperor wanted to send a message. A new prince had arrived, and he would either survive his first battle or die proving his weakness. John had no choice in the matter. The moment he was sent to the war camp, he realized how out of place he truly was. Drakari warriors towered over him, their bodies covered in heavy armor and brutal weapons. These were warriors who had trained since childhood, battle-hardened veterans who had conquered entire worlds. And then there was John, a human, with zero military experience. A commander named General Korak looked him up and down with a sneer. You expect me to lead a fleshling into battle? John forced a grin. Trust me, I don't expect anything. This was all a mistake. Korak narrowed his eyes. We shall see. John's first battle. The battlefield was a storm of fire and chaos. John had been thrown onto the front lines alongside Syra's personal warband. They had been sent to a remote colony on the edges of Drakari space, one that had recently been raided by the Orion Syndicate. The mission, take it back. The problem. The Orion forces were waiting for them. The moment John and the others landed, the enemy opened fire. Explosions tore through the ground, plasma bolts scorching the sky. John ducked behind cover, his heart hammering. This wasn't a fight. It was a slaughter. Movie. Ira roared, cutting down an enemy with a single strike. John forced himself to run. Adrenaline took over. He didn't have the training the Drakari did, but he had something else. His human instincts. While the Drakari warriors focused on brute strength, John saw things differently. He noticed weak points in enemy formations, flaws in their defenses. Instead of charging headfirst into gunfire like the others, John used his brain. He grabbed a fallen mercenary's plasma rifle and took cover, scanning the battlefield. He spotted a group of enemy snipers hidden on a ridge, perfectly positioned to wipe out the advancing troops. John didn't hesitate. He grabbed a fallen grenade and hurled it toward the ridge. Boom! The explosion sent enemy bodies flying, and the Drakari warriors charged through the opening. The battle turned. John found himself fighting alongside Syra, covering her back as they pushed forward. She was unstoppable, moving like a storm of steel and fury. But for the first time, John felt like he belonged. Because somehow, he was still alive. The aftermath. The battle was won. The Drakari claimed victory over the Orion forces. The colony was secured. John, however, was exhausted. As he sat on the ground, trying to catch his breath, Syra stood over him. For the first time, she looked at him with something that wasn't frustration or anger. It was respect. You survived, she said. John gave a weak chuckle. Barely. Syra extended a hand. Come. We have much to discuss. John frowned. What now? She smirked. You proved yourself on the battlefield. That means you are no longer just my accidental husband. John's stomach twisted. What does that mean? Syra's violet eyes glowed. It means you are now a prince of war. John groaned, falling back onto the ground. I really need to start reading the fine print before I sit in random chairs. Syra laughed. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, John felt like maybe, just maybe, he had a place in this strange new world. The human factor. John Carter had never been more tired in his life. The battle was over. The Drakari forces had won. But victory came at a cost. Half their warriors were dead or wounded, and the Orion Syndicate had left traps and sabotage devices all over the captured colony. John sat on a broken crate, his hands shaking. His body ached from the fight. His arms were covered in dirt, sweat, and a little too much alien blood. This wasn't like the movies. Killing someone, even an enemy, didn't feel heroic. It felt heavy. And now he wasn't just some lost human who got mixed up in royal politics. Now he was a prince of war. And that was terrifying. A new reality. The Drakari war camp buzzed with activity. Medics rushed between the wounded, while engineers worked to restore power to the ruined colony. John had expected to be ignored, but instead, warriors kept looking at him. They weren't sneering anymore. They weren't calling him weak. Some nodded in respect. Others whispered his name like it was something important now. John Carter, the human prince. He wasn't sure how he felt about that. Zara approached, removing her blood-stained armor and tossing it aside. She was exhausted but still stood tall, powerful. "You fought well," she said simply. John sighed. "Not well enough. A lot of people still died." Zara studied him for a moment. "That is war." John shook his head. "Doesn't mean I have to like it." She frowned. "You are strange." John laughed bitterly. "Yeah, I get that a lot. A problem no blade can solve." The Drakari were warriors. They were fearless, brutal, and strong. But as John watched their engineers struggle to fix a broken power relay, he realized something. They weren't problem solvers. They weren't builders. They were fighters. And that meant they were about to die from their own victory. John stood, wiping dirt from his hands. "What's the biggest problem we're dealing with right now?" Zara raised an eyebrow. "The wounded, the power grid, and the food supply." John nodded. "And what's the plan?" Zara shrugged. "We wait for reinforcements." John frowned. That was a mistake. They didn't have time to wait. The Orion Syndicate had fled, but they weren't gone. They could return at any moment. If the Drakari forces weren't back to full strength soon, they'd be wiped out. John turned toward the struggling engineers. "Move," he said. The workers stared at him. "What?" John grabbed a toolkit from one of them and knelt beside the broken power relay. "This isn't how you fix a grid system," he muttered, scanning the ancient technology. "This whole setup is running on redundant relays, but your circuits are getting fried because of energy backflow. You need to reroute power from the secondary grid before you attempt a full restart." Silence. The Drakari engineers blinked at him. John sighed. "Watch and learn." He got to work. It took an hour of sweating, cursing, and nearly getting electrocuted. But in the end, the lights came back on. A hum of energy rippled through the colony. Medical stations powered up, emergency rations were processed, and shields around the perimeter flickered to life. The Drakari warriors stared in shock. John stood, wiping his forehead. "There. Fixed." Zara crossed her arms, eyeing him carefully. "You are not a warrior." John snorted. "Yeah, no kidding." "But you are something else," she murmured. "Something my people have never had." John raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" She smirked. "A problem solver. A different kind of strength." The next few days were the strangest of John's life. Instead of fighting, he spent his time fixing things. He optimized the supply chain so food reached wounded soldiers faster. He reworked weapons distribution, ensuring every warrior had the right gear. He even rebuilt part of the colony's water filtration system after realizing the Drakari had been drinking contaminated water. The warriors watched him closely. At first, some laughed, but as they saw the results, their respect for him grew. John had no combat skills. He wasn't strong. But he had something else. He had human ingenuity. The Drakari change. One night, as John sat by a campfire, General Korak approached. The massive war leader, who once mocked John for being weak, now looked at him with something different. Respect. Korak sat beside him. "You have changed our war camp." John shrugged. "Just doing what I can." The general nodded. "Drakari warriors do not think like this. We are taught to fight, not to adapt. You are different. John smirked. I think the word you're looking for is smart. Korak chuckled. Perhaps. And yet, I wonder. John frowned. Wonder what? Korak leaned closer. Are you certain you are not meant to be king? John nearly choked on his drink. What? No. Zaira is the future ruler, not me. Korak gave a slow, knowing smile. Perhaps. But tell me, human, when was the last time a mere consort changed the course of a war? John had no answer. The future of a prince. Later that night, Zaira found him. She sat beside him in silence for a moment before speaking. You are dangerous, she said finally. John blinked. Me? She nodded. My people respect strength. But now, they are looking at you differently. They are not just respecting you. They are. She hesitated. They are following you. John's stomach twisted. I don't want power. Zaira studied him. Maybe not, but the people want a leader who can win wars without throwing bodies at the enemy. John exhaled. Great. So now I'm a prince who's also a war strategist. Zaira smirked. Welcome to royal life. He shook his head. And what do you think of all this? Zaira was quiet for a moment. Then, softly, she said, I think I misjudged you. John blinked. That was probably the closest thing to a compliment he was going to get. Zaira stood, her violet eyes locking onto his. The war is not over, John Carter. The Orion Syndicate will return. John sighed. Of course they will. She extended a hand. Then stand with me. As a prince, as a warrior, as, she hesitated, as my partner. John looked at her hand. The battle was over, but the real war was just beginning. And for the first time, John wasn't just surviving. He was fighting for something bigger. With a deep breath, he took Zaira's hand. Let's win this war. The final choice. John Carter never expected to be standing at the heart of an intergalactic empire, with warriors chanting his name, warlords bowing their heads, and a warrior princess watching him closely. And yet, here he was. The war against the Orion Syndicate had escalated beyond anything he imagined. Skirmishes had turned into battles. Battles had turned into full-scale planetary conflicts. And now, the fate of an entire empire rested on a single decision. His decision. Would he stay and lead alongside Zaira, embracing his role as a prince of war? Or would he walk away, leaving behind a legacy that had already begun to shape the future of the Drakari? The moment had come, and John was running out of time. The war comes to a head. The Orion Syndicate had returned in force. After suffering humiliating defeats at the hands of the Drakari Human Alliance, they had rallied every criminal warlord, pirate fleet, and rogue mercenary faction under a single banner of destruction. Their message was clear. Crush the Drakari, kill the human prince, burn their empire to the ground. John stood in the war command chamber, staring at a holographic map of the battlefield. The enemy fleet was massive. Hundreds of warships, thousands of soldiers, and enough firepower to wipe out a planet. The Drakari forces were outnumbered. Badly. The high generals, battle-hardened warriors who once dismissed John as a weakling, now looked to him with expectant eyes. They waited for him to speak. John exhaled. This isn't just a battle, he said finally. It's the endgame. Zaira, standing at his side, nodded. Then we make our final stand. John's gaze swept across the room. These warriors followed him now, not because he was the strongest, not because he was Drakari, but because he had proven himself. Now he had to prove himself one last time. The final battle begins. The Drakari fleet launched into hyperspace, racing toward the Orion Syndicate's war fleet. The battle would take place above a desolate, war-torn world, a planet reduced to ash from past conflicts. The moment they arrived, the Orion fleet opened fire. The stars exploded with light as laser barrages, missile storms, and energy cannons clashed in a chaotic battle. Warships twisted through space, their shields flaring under heavy assault. Fighter squadrons weaved between the destruction, locked in dogfights. John sat in the command seat of the flagship, gripping the armrests. His mind raced. If they fought the Orion fleet head-on, they would lose. He needed a different strategy. John activated the war map, scanning the battlefield. And then, he saw it. A weakness. The Orion fleet is using a centralized AI network to coordinate their attacks, John muttered. It's keeping them organized. If we take out their command ship, their fleet falls into chaos. Syra finished, her eyes lighting up. John grinned. Exactly. But there was one problem. The Orion command ship was buried deep in enemy lines, heavily guarded. A suicide run. Syra turned to him. We'll lead the attack. John hesitated. You mean I will lead the attack? Syra's gaze didn't waver. You are the Prince of War now. Prove it. John's stomach twisted. This was it. The final moment. The final choice. The suicide mission. John suited up for battle. For the first time, he wasn't just a prisoner, an accident, or a survivor. He was a leader. The attack force launched, tearing through the battlefield in small, fast ships. John piloted his fighter alongside Syra's, dodging through enemy fire as they raced toward the command ship. Explosions rocked space. The Orion fleet tried to stop them, but the Drakari warriors fought with everything they had. Ships exploded, weapons fired, shields flickered and died. John's heart hammered. He could see it, the massive command ship, a fortress floating in the void. All units, John called into his communicator, target the engines, cut off their escape. The Drakari fighters swooped in, firing plasma torpedoes at the command ship's thrusters. Massive explosions rippled across the hull. John's ship barreled through the chaos, dodging debris and enemy fire. They were almost there. And then, an enemy warship locked onto John. A missile launched. Syra saw it first. John, EGCT, she shouted. John didn't think. He hit the eject lever just as his fighter exploded in a fiery blast. His body was thrown through space, tumbling wildly toward the Orion command ship. This was not the plan. The final fight. John crashed onto the command ship's surface, his armor absorbing most of the impact. He coughed, forcing himself up. He was alone, stranded inside the enemy's flagship, and the Orion warlord was waiting for him. The towering armored alien. Valer Khan, the leader of the syndicate. Stood with a massive energy blade in hand. You have been a thorn in my side for far too long, human, Valer growled. Now, I will end you. John pulled out his plasma pistol. Yeah, well, good luck with that. Valer lunged. John dodged, barely, rolling across the steel floor as the blade slammed down inches from his head. Sparks flew. John fired 3 shots, but Valer's armor deflected them. Of course you have a force field, John muttered. The warlord swung again, and John ducked, his mind racing. He couldn't win in a fight. But maybe he didn't have to. John's gaze flicked to the control panel nearby. A self-destruct system. Bingo. Valer charged again, but John dove for the control panel, slamming his hand against it. Alert. Self-destruct sequence EINITATED. The warlord froze. John grinned. Looks like we're both gonna have a bad day. The last-second escape. John sprinted for the nearest escape pod as alarms blared. Behind him, the Orion warlord roared in fury, but it was too late. As John launched out of the command ship, he saw the massive explosion rip through the Syndicate's fleet. The command ship detonated, its wreckage ripping through enemy forces. The Orion fleet fell into chaos. And the Drakari. They swooped in and crushed them. The war was over. The final choice. John stood on the royal flagship, looking out at the victory celebration. He had done it. But now, it was time to decide. Did he return to Earth? Or did he stay? Zyra stood beside him. You have earned your freedom. John exhaled. Yeah, but what if I don't want it? Zyra's violet eyes studied him. Then what do you want? John looked at her. At the warriors who followed him. At the empire he had helped shape. And he smiled. I think I'll stick around. Zyra smirked. Good. You still have much to learn, my husband. John laughed. Yeah. And you still owe me a real wedding. The stars stretched before them. And John Carter, once a simple mechanic from Earth, was now something more. A warrior. A leader. A legend. And he was just getting started.